So it seems that some rather strong Warhammer 40k rules have escaped confinement early. Let's talk about the news and how it could be one of the single strongest things for the Necrons to be able to put on the tabletop going forward. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd do an overview of the big rules leak, talk over the things that have come out for them, and what the rules could mean in-game. I'm sure plenty of people are well aware of this already, but it basically seems that Grotmas has come one day early for the Necrons. In the AdMech teaser that we had earlier in the day, it was confirmed that Necrons would be coming on Friday, a fact that already had been quite strongly hinted and people were expecting already due to a previous leak, but basically now the full rules of that detachment have been widely circulated around just about every Discord group, subreddit and every other place that Warhammer 40k rules are discussed by now. I've had it sent to me by lots of different people, and it certainly looks interesting enough to warrant talking through. The leak itself came from an accidental early upload from another YouTube channel. Plenty of channels out there get their information in advance and have an NDA with Games Workshop, which says they're not allowed to share those rules until Games Workshop share them properly themselves, so accidentally publishing early isn't exactly ideal on their part. I'll not name the channel for this one, as they might not want even more publicity about the leak, unless they do want crediting for the information, in which case I'll add it down in a pinned comment if they reach out to me. In any case though, it does seem a bit silly to pretend it's not happening, given the rules are being quite so widely shared right now. So for this one I thought I'd do an overview of the leak, obviously with spoiler alerts for anyone who doesn't want to know the content of the next day. And I think unless there's something enormously important to talk about on Friday, I'll still aim to cover the detachment as normal in its own video, once we know all the information's confirmed and there aren't any errors and things, and with the saved time maybe try and make it a little bit more of an in-depth video than a few of my quick reacts, maybe with a few more unit focuses, combos, and an army list example. In any case though, jumping into it, and the name of the detachment for the Necrons is the Starshatter Arsenal, a name that had already been going around from earlier in the week, where it seemed that Games Workshop themselves had given us a bit of a teaser as to that name, as it's present in some file upload names, along with things like the Hex Warp Thrallband for the Thousand Suns. It wasn't 100% clear exactly which faction it would be, though I think most people were suspecting Necrons given the name. Perhaps Eldari, Drukhari, or maybe Leagues of Votann might have fit. Starshatter did seem really quite Necron though, given their godly technology and enjoyment of fracturing star gods. In the interim, it looks like someone even decided to find the time to make this lore-accurate Necron stratagem. For one command point in any phase, you target the nearest star with a stratagem, that star goes into supernova. Your opponent loses the battle, and if you roll 10d6 and all the results are a 6, you can never play Warhammer 40k again. Perhaps thankfully that's not a real one, though it looks like a few of the stratagems are only a little bit less powerful than that. In any case, I was speculating that if it was Necrons, it'd either be a Catan-focused one, given the Starshatter thing, or a vehicle-focused mech Necrons thing, given that that was a theme that wasn't really present in their codex. I guess the Hypercrypt focused it around Titanic vehicles, but they didn't have one that really was a good place for other things like Annihilation barges and Doomsday Arcs, at least with dedicated rules for them, so it seems to be this. I feel like out of the two, probably the mech Necrons was the best way to go, really. I don't think that most people would have wanted to see Necron players get any more incentive to spam entire armies worth of Catan. Jumping into the actual rules though, and first up we have the core rule, which is Relentless Onslaught, and as we go through this, just bear in mind that these are based on leaks. We'll only get full confirmation if there's any subtle details wrong tomorrow. Either way though, the central rule does seem incredibly powerful. It gives you a +1 to hit against enemy units on objectives, and non-Titanic vehicles and mounted units all gain the assault keyword. The +1 to hit army-wide against objective units is really quite a nasty buff for them. The majority of Necron units can get good mileage out of that. There's not really too much that hits on a 2+, and unless we get any clarification to the otherwise, it sounds like this one applies both at range and in melee, so it's hard to go too far wrong with. It's going to happen just anyway that you need to destroy enemy units on objectives just due to the way that Warhammer 40k is played. Though I guess maybe there is a little bit of counterplay with your opponent's really big damage and defense units, perhaps wanting to stand off objectives and leave the objective grabbing to more expendable stuff. Though even then, I guess that could lead you to wins with victory points, as it's being easier to take the enemy off objectives with the units that they do put on them. That feels like that'd be quite a useful core rule in the first place, but also getting vehicles and mounted units gaining the assault keyword means that if you've got a whole bunch of shooting Necrons with those keywords, then they can get very mobile. This detachment does look like it's going to be incredibly good for supporting Doomsday Arcs, which are already one of the single strongest Necron units, never mind getting an entire detachment focused around them. They'd be able to move really quite quickly with this, and even faster with a stratagem, but nice enough for things like the Silent King, Annihilation barges, Locust destroyers and Heavy destroyers. And it's interesting that the Locust and the Locust Heavies between this and all the stratagem support look like they get far more here than the Annihilation Legion gives. I feel like that detachment should have really had a bit more focus between both the range and the melee destroyers. Overall though, seems like a great core rule, a bit more mobility and a bit more consistent damage. Moving on to stratagems, and just about every one of these seems incredibly useful in the right situation. First up, Merciless Reclamation just seems like a slightly horrendous double down on the main detachment rule. Any non-titanic unit gets a +1 to wound against targeting enemy units on objectives, so for 1 CP, your Necron unit of whatever damage it might have had gets +1 to hit and +1 to wound. Between this and the detachment rule, so it's going to be hitting most of its hits and wounding most of its wounds. I don't know if there's more nuance to this, whether it could be locked to just the detachment units like say vehicles and mounted, but it doesn't appear so from the leak. It sounds like it's that and also melee, but even if it was more limited, it'd still be an absolutely great stratagem. Provided the opponent's got targets worth killing on the midfield objectives, that one seems fairly easy to use every single turn. Next up, for 1 command point, there's Unyielding Forms. This one's a nice reactive durability one, a -1 to wound a non-titanic vehicle or mounted unit if it's attacked, provided it was being hit by something with a greater strength than its toughness, as is often the limitation for those stratagems. This one does seem very useful for the majority of Necron vehicles though. They don't have the highest toughness characteristics in the world, such as the Doomsday Ark having a toughness 9. And as a result, it's really quite a strong reactive durability stratagem. I feel like you could easily justify that if it's about to get focused by a whole bunch of anti-tank fire. Looks like you could also use it on the Silent King as well, which is rather intimidating given that he is such a massive, great big defensive profile in the first place. If the opponent's lining up a whole bunch of big las cannons and things, then that could go down very nicely to shield him from a bunch of fire. Again, it easily feels like one that you could probably use just about every turn. There's definitely going to be decisions to be made as to where best to spend the command points. Next up, for 1 CP, we've got Chrono Shift. This one allows you to auto-advance 6 inches for a non-titanic vehicle or a mounted unit. That works really nicely in combination with the assault weapons rule, so you could have a 16-inch moving Doomsday Ark that can still shoot, or Locust Destroyers or Heavy Destroyers getting a serious shift on to move around the board. Could be a good one to use as well if you needed a long advance roll to get your unit onto an objective. You could just dial it in for 1 command point. This one feels like the sort of stratagem that you wouldn't ideally normally want to have to use, but in reality with the positioning of units throughout a game, sometimes it's going to be absolutely well worth it. Next up, for 1 command point, there's Dimensional Tunnel. This one allows a non-titanic vehicle or mounted units to ghost straight through terrain. This one does seem to be at least a fairly common one for big monster or vehicle type detachments. The Tyranid Crusher Stampede got one. Apparently the Guard Armoured Tank one will get one as well, and it looks like the Necrons have too. This one just makes moving up the board super easy for big scary vehicles, which otherwise might often have to compromise between hiding behind ruins to stay safe, and then that often means that they have to go around, so don't really get all that much further in board position once they expose themselves. This one just means they could go straight through those though, and potentially advance on the mid board really quickly. On paper, this one feels like the scariest thing could be to use it on the Silent King. Being able to get his massive defensive profile and big damage up the board dead fast seems like an enormous win really. I'm sure to have a lot of good impact for other units on the board as well. Next up, for 1 command point, there's Endless Servitude. This one allows you to activate reanimation protocols for a non-titanic unit, provided you're in range of an objective you control. Apparently this one happens at the end of the fight phase, so I guess if you're trying to use it on your opponent's turn, your unit would actually have to survive all the attacks that it got hit with. I guess for infantry units and things, which it does sound like you can use it on, you might be able to pile more bodies back onto an objective before you score it. But just in general, between this and normal reanimation, you could be regenerating really quite a lot of wounds, and more so if you've got a Canoptic Reanimator nearby. I guess that'd mean that you'd have 8 wounds on average restored to the unit that used this. So a pretty powerful way of basically pinging a big unit back to full health. I guess actually being on an objective that you control might be a little bit limiting if your opponents move forward and taking you off it, so it might not be quite as good for grabbing objectives, I guess, unless you can chain out to 2 of them. Maybe extra nice for anything that you can reliably hold though if you've got one in the mid-board that your opponent's just not going to be able to take you off, or your home objective where you might have some other units sitting on it to stop enemies grabbing it. Finally, for 1 command point, there's Reactive Repositioning, and this one looks like a slightly horrific one to fight against. A non-titanic unit that gets shot gets to move d6 inches afterwards, or if they're a vehicle or mounted unit, they get to move a flat 6 inches instead. Getting a reactive movement in the enemy's turn is really quite disruptive. I guess if you're imagining a great big tank battle for Necrons with things like Doomsday Arks about, I could certainly picture one taking firepower and then basically just moving out of line of sight of the next thing that wanted to focus on it, hopefully meaning that the enemy kills 0 Doomsday Arks and then they all just start reanimating. But otherwise even the d6 inches one could be worth it, maybe if it made the difference of hiding behind a ruin or backpedaling from an enemy charge. I'm sure it'd be a bit disappointing for an oncoming assault unit that was like 5 inches away from you, and the enemy puts some damage into a Doomsday Ark or Silent King or something with shooting, and then all of a sudden they're 11 inches away. Overall, this one seems like a really strong set of stratagems to go with a pretty usable core rule for the detachment, loads of strength and lots of good options here. The damage and defense boosting ones seem really useful, being able to move fast or walk through walls with vehicles, both really help movement. The reanimation trick seems absolutely great with a reanimator, and then the repositioning one could be hugely disruptive against enemy gun lines. Based on the leaks, it seems like they're literally all good. Moving on though, and it doesn't seem to slow down much for the enhancements. First up, we've got one that's only Overlord or Catacomb Command Barge. It's Dread Majesty and is apparently 30 points. This one gives the bearer an aura of reroll hits and wounds of 1 within 6 inches to all non-Titanic units, and there's nothing on the leak text that says anything about range versus melee, so that just seems like a fairly staggeringly powerful damage boost to literally everything in range, particularly crazy in a detachment where you've also got very easy access to +1 to hit and +1 to wound. In theory, on units that neither have hit or wound rerolls, it's really quite a powerful buff, essentially plus 36% damage output. It does overlap with the Silent King's ability though, as he can already hand that out at range to units nearby himself. I don't know if there'd be any other restrictions beyond that, but it seems kind of awesome for Doomsday Arcs. Seems like there's a few options that you could do with how to field it. You could have an Overlord in a squad, you could use a Catacomb Command Barge, which are at least a lot cheaper now, and this one actually gives them a command ability worth having. Or I guess potentially you could even run an Overlord just completely solo and hide them out of line of sight on ruins, and you'd still be able to affect a bunch of nearby units. Even if the Overlord was just doing its own thing and just leading some Lich Guard around or something like that though, it still seems to be a damage output boost easily worth having for even just that squad, if indeed there aren't any other hidden restrictions. Next up, we've got a miniaturized nebula scope, ignores cover for this model's unit. This one's nice and simple and effective, seems very easy to use if you had Immortals or Warriors doing a damage dealing combo. You could put this on a Plasmancer or Chronomancer or something. Certainly seems easy enough to use, though I feel like perhaps those units don't synergize quite as much with the rest of the detachment. I guess you could potentially put it on a Destroyer Lord and then lead a squad of Locust Destroyers around. That seems pretty reasonable for a whole load of ignores cover Gauss with sustained hits and then the objective buffs. However it gets used, it does seem like a reasonable points cost for what it does. Next up for 10 points we have Demanding Leader. This one's nice and cheap, and it means that non-Titanic vehicles and mounted units can fall back and shoot within 6 inches of this. I feel like the enhancement for the 10 points is really good for the price it is. It's maybe a bit more of a question as to if you can justify the character to put it on. Even cheaper support characters, once you've bought them a squad of Necrons so they don't instantly get shot, will already be racking up really quite a lot of points for a character that's maybe just safeguarding some vehicles. Maybe if you had a cheap support character that was going spare though, doing something else useful in a unit and then could also bear this, it'd be nice. Or if you wanted it on a dedicated model, I suppose you could use a Hexmark Destroyer. Finally, we've got Chrono Impotence Field for 25 points. One non-Titanic vehicle or mounted unit within 6 inches gets -1 damage to it, chosen in the command phase. The obvious one for that feels like it's the Silent King once again, who would just be absolutely monstrously hard to take down with this on the go. If you're willing to be a little bit spendy on the stratagems, the Silent King could have this -1 damage from a nearby hex mark or something, be hidden out of line of sight and then ghost through the ruined walls to get somewhere scary in the midboard, and then if the enemy targets him with big heavy weapons, then put him -1 to wound as well. Maybe even doing extra reanimation at the end of the fight phase if you have enough command points. Even if it wasn't for Zarek himself though, it still seems very strong for just putting on the most exposed vehicle each turn. If the Doomsday Arc that the opponent's really going to have to shoot at is out at the front, then give this to it, and their firepower is going to be going significantly less far, particularly as a bunch of special weapon fire can actually be quite good against Doomsday Arcs. Overall though, if the leaks do wind up being accurate enough, it does seem like a pretty monstrously strong detachment. The detachment rule is really quite powerful, very easy extra damage and also fast vehicles. The Silent King looks like he's absolutely going to love this detachment, the ability to go through walls, get -1 damage for an enhancement and -1 to wound for a stratagem. That's all really quite intimidating on such a big scary model who can also support the Doomsday Arc so well. As mentioned, Doomsday Arcs are one of the strongest Necron vehicles at the moment, and kind of makes sense to have 3 of them if you're going for this detachment at 2,000 points I suspect. They're already pretty solidly the best Necron firepower, and are only going to get more so with all this support. They can move around really quite quickly and still potentially be hitting on a 2+ as well, maybe even flexing into a +1 to wound if they need it. Otherwise, the Canoptek Reanimator looks like it could be worth bringing one along for 1 command point to translate into essentially 4 wounds restored on something. I'd certainly like to see the full wording for that stratagem. If it's activating reanimation on literally any non-Titanic unit, that seems kind of hellish on Catan, though if it's only on vehicles and things, that's still good. Theoretically, restoring 8 wounds to the Silent King or so on average is kind of crazy with the durability buffs that he can get as well. He feels like he'd be borderline unkillable if you went max with that. The +1 to wound damage thing, it seems really quite powerful on just about anything. The reactive moves mean that if you position the units right, mean that certain things could occasionally get saved from either more shooting or a charge. And the detachment's got loads of support for things like Tomb Blaze, Locusts, and Locust Heavy Destroyers as well, which all could find some good stuff here, maybe even leader combos with the Locust Lord. Overall, based on first impressions on this leak, it does seem like an incredibly scary detachment. I would say that this is probably going to come in context of the balanced data slate for the Necrons as well, where I really wouldn't be too surprised if Doomsday Arcs get a points increase. They did feel like a unit that absolutely didn't really need to go down to 190 points in the last update to start with. If it was just completely as it stands though, it feels like it could be one of the strongest Necron detachments, if not the strongest. It's definitely got far more damage and defense versus things like the Hypercrypt that wouldn't have quite as much objective scoring tricks. Being able to repeatedly redeploy units and 3-inch deep strike them means that lots of secondaries are almost auto-complete. This army would have to move fairly fast and play pretty aggressively to bring all that damage to bear. Though I feel like with triple Doomsday Arc and the Silent King, you're probably going to win a whole load of firefights with all the support they get here. In any case though, it looks rather terrifying. As mentioned, I'll aim to check back tomorrow when we've got the full detachment reveal. Talk through a few of the same things, including any other nuances to the stratagems and stuff, and maybe focus a little bit on a couple of the standout units and look at an example army list. In any case, look forward to hearing what you guys think of that one. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics or check back later if you'd like to see more like this. I do tend to post 40k videos just about every day, and I'll be aiming to cover all of the Grotmas detachments. I've got a playlist for them linked down in the video description, and I'll add new videos to it as I make them. I'm really looking forward to seeing what else comes next as always. Otherwise, feel free to check out the links in the video description. The channel's got a Patreon page as the main thing that supports the channel here. Backers get a few benefits, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next, and automatic entry into the prize giveaways each month. So feel free to check that out in the video description. In any case though, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.